where they will use the idea of a certain level of force depending upon the threat. I'll tell you what Batman's looks like right here, and then we'll talk about what real police looks like. So in the case, first thing is Batman's mere physical presence ends the fight. So something's going on, Batman literally comes swooping in, drops in the middle of everybody. Everybody is terrified of what Batman will do, so they just give up. That's level one. If that doesn't happen, he might try to reason with them and possibly threaten them. If he's attacked, he'll try to use hand-to-hand fighting to subdue them. If that doesn't work, he might use something like knockouts, gas, or some kind of spray, or some non-lethal weapon. Eventually, he gets to use the non-lethal weapons here. This X means using lethal force, where Batman won't use that. Now, this is Batman. Batman, whose career is bent on this idea we said earlier of burning out rather than fading away. He doesn't particularly care if he gets, doesn't want to get killed, but he would sooner be killed himself than have to kill somebody in fighting. This is not a reasonable expectation for our police officers who go out to respond to calls in normal society. We expect them to come home. We expect them to not get killed when they go out and do things. They use a one-over. In other words, if Batman says here that they still do this. If they just show up in the car, the police cruiser won't stop, that's fine, they don't have to do anything. But this idea of Batman's attacked and tries to subdue opponent hand to hand, no. In police services, it's always one above. So if somebody has empty hand, they're going to attack the officer uses a baton. If the person has a knife, the officer uses a gun. You don't go even Steven. You always got to be one above to try and push the threat back down. But Batman doesn't do that. In fact, what we see mostly with Batman is this kind of thing, as I said, from this comic book in the 80s where you can't see very well, but some of the people like Nightwing and Robin and Batgirl have been pulled up by a huge mob, and Batman just shows up and says, "Disperse now," and everybody takes off. It says, "Major intimidation, not a single knuckle dusted." Batman's got that going for him because he's got the terror angle, because the criminals don't know what he's capable of doing. They don't really buy into the idea he won't kill them. They're frightened. He knows he won't, but they don't know that, and he's able to use that, whereas real-life police officers obviously can't be doing something. One of the things that might be sneaking into your head at this point, just as it was about the idea of the bat suit, you might be going, how long would all this training take if you could actually do this, right? Is anybody thinking that? Nodding? Does anyone want to say how long does this training take? No?
Yeah.
Yes, you want to say it? Okay. How long does this training take? Let's think about three components. The first is what I call the Bruce stage. This is 3 to 5 years basic training and physical prowess grounding. So it's about 3 to 5 years, depends on exactly how it breaks down. 6 to 12 years of skill training and refining for the Batman, the Bat-Man stage. Finally, another 6 to 8 years for poise, experience, and seasoned Batman. This is the part where it's much quicker to just build and train people to use lethal force and use lethal weapons to kill people. That's a military objective. In the case of Batman, it's much different because he's got to be using the non-lethal weapons and not killing people, which takes this huge, great big long time. It's about a 15 to 18 year training program for a career that's likely 2 to 3 years long. Now, you might ask, how did I come up with this 2 to 3 year number? Is this Zehr guy just pulling these numbers out of his head? Where did all this come from? Well, the 2 to 3 year career thing, as I looked at real life occupations that had the same physical stresses, that was getting pounded all the time. So you look at NFL and CFL running backs and football players and how their lives and their average career is about 3 years. In the case of Batman, it means never losing, because in real life, if there were a real Batman and he loses to the criminals, they just kill him. In the comic books, he gets away and does something again, and in the movies, he gets another chance always. But in reality, he's probably going to be dead. So he can never lose. So what I did was I looked at boxers, people who are doing fighting things. What's the longest period of time a boxer could maintain their belt? What's the longest period of time that ultimate fighters could, and UFC type fighters could maintain their status without ever losing? And you don't get much beyond 2 to 3 years before something happens that fluke things. And so Batman's really got a 2 to 3 year career with a very long training thing. But why? What happens to him? Why does that happen in those other cases? Why does it happen generally? Why couldn't the career go on and on? We'll come back to that idea of homeostasis that we started with earlier with Claude Bernard and Walter Cannon and Hans Zelliot. This idea that you get balance in the body. If you get a balance that's challenged by the internal or external events, what we started with, fretting your finger on a fretboard on a guitar, all the way to the idea of getting pounded by bad guys at night and training to become Batman. Your body compensates to restore the balance. If it succeeds, you've got wellness. If it fails, you've got illness. And what happens is eventually we'll drift over to this side with too much stress and strain in the body. And a good example of this is what's called the Nightfall story arc. And that was shown in a very long series of comics in the 90s, where this guy named Bane, who will be the main bad guy in the next Dark Knight movie, he's really, really not a good person. And he really, really wants to be like Batman and defeat him. He's also really quite smart. So what he does is instead of going to fight Batman, and you can see Batman looks awful here. You know, he's drawn, he's shaking. He says, I've got no more power, no more speed. Thud, 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 falls over, no more reflexes, easily defeated, and in fact he gets the worst injury he's ever sustained in the history of the Batman comic books. He gets a serious spinal cord injury from fighting with Bane. And what we see here is Bane was really smart. To add on to, he knows Batman's always tired, he's always running around doing stuff at night to save everybody, that vigilante justice thing we started with. What he does is he goes to Arkham Asylum where all the bad guys are, and instead of going right to fight Batman, he opens the doors to Arkham and lets everybody out. Because he knows Batman will have to go round everybody up. And so for months, Batman goes out every night, fights all the bad guys, puts them back in Arkham. That's when Bane comes along. Look at Batman's shape here. We've had a failure to compensate, to get balance, a failure of homeostasis in the body, and this is what results catastrophic injury. This is just an example of the idea that one of the things that is very rarely shown, but was shown in The Dark Knight, is the idea that Batman gets injured.
Stitch yourself up. You'll make a bloody mess.
Yeah, that makes me learn from my mistakes.
We will be pretty knowledgeable about it.
My armor carrying too much weight to be fast.
I'm sure Mr. Fox will oblige.
So this one the first time.
He's a dog.
Huh?
He's a big dog.
He's a bit embarrassed that he got bit by a dog. But this is one of the first times Batman's actually even shown to be injured in any of these movies where you see a serious injury. And it's important because he's always going to be experiencing these kind of things. Any athlete is in their own training, not even to the extreme of Batman. And over his career, he's getting all kinds of trauma in the form of concussion. One of the things I specifically look for is I was curious, how often, Batman takes a pretty serious pounding, how often did they ever show him with a concussion? Well, almost never. And when it does, it's shown as kind of a joke here. I need a computer to count the skull knocks I've taken. I've never experienced symptoms like these. I must have swallowed a lot of the drug coffee. Ha ha. He thinks he's had a drug. He did have a drug coffee in the episode here. But still, it's because he's repeatedly getting bashed around. Here we see Catwoman is working with Batman over the whole history. Batman's had a very bizarre relationship with Catwoman. Sometimes they're on the same side. Usually she's a criminal. Sometimes there's a romantic interest. It's all over the place. In this case, they're working together, and she says, good Lord. And he says, what, bad burn? No, it's just all this scar tissue on your back. Oh, that. Occupational hazard. 15 years of fighting will do that to a person. Does it hurt? Sometimes. You learn to live with it. So he's got all this kind of trauma that the body is accumulating. This is what helps give this 2 to 3 year career, and 10 years is the absolute maximum. I get the 10-year range with the idea that some people in boxing and ultimate fighting and some NFL types can have longer careers if they're really efficient. So Batman shows up on the rooftops a lot of time, just lines up there, and everybody goes, okay, we're done, no fighting involved. Maybe that happens most of the time, you can have closer to a longer career. This whole thing is called in the medical literature, this idea, not Batman, but the idea of experiencing all this damage to your body. Cumulative trauma disorder, and Batman sure accumulates lots of trauma. And the last clip I want to show in this presentation is a game from The Dark Knight. There's going to be 2 events that happen here that are just, they're really kind of hard to watch in terms of how abrupt it is in the body, but that is really hard on your body. Next, he's somehow able to get up even though he'd have a significant concussion at this point. Because all that training doesn't protect your brain inside your capacity or inside your head. So, pretty extreme. Slamming into a post right here. Very hard on the body. Or jumping quite a distance onto a moving van. These are things that we see Batman doing repeatedly in the comics and in the movies. Sure. are things the human body could do one time. Once he slams into the post, that's pretty much it. He's going to be unconscious. And when he jumps off the thing, maybe, depending on how much reinforcement he has in the suit, that might shock absorb some of it, he can do it a few times. But what really happens if we think about concussion in the brain, this idea that when Batman or any person is being subjected to a heavy hit in hockey or into something hard like a post, it's a big effect on the metabolism in the brain. So what we see here is this idea that concussive event occurs here. There's a sudden increase in the demand for energy, but there's a big reduction in blood flow, and there's reduction in blood flow, pardon me, and the metabolism goes down, whereas you need more here. It takes up to a week for some of that to recover, and you can have these lingering symptoms